Okay. Hello and welcome to another précis summary of what's been going on in the nuclear world. Now it's April 2026. And of course, it has to be the case that this podcast couldn't start without talking about the significance of the 26th of April 1986, 40 years ago, which is when the Chernobyl disaster actually occurred in what is currently Ukraine, and was still Ukraine, but as part of the USSR back in the day. And some people say that the Ukraine disaster actually helped to bring about the fall of the USSR in 1989, the way that the Gorbachev administration handled appallingly the fallout, literally and politically, from the disaster. Now, what happened? What you think happened at Chernobyl will depend very much on the sources that you refer to. The whitewash is that there's look away, nothing much to see here. Um, I, for one, would certainly take a very different view. Um, the World Nuclear Association report on the disaster indicates that it was the result of flawed reactor design that was operated with inadequately trained personnel. And that's the truth, and that's the nub of it. Um, so let's start with the flawed reactor design. Um, there's currently a BBC documentary called What Happened at Chernobyl, which sheds what, to my eyes, is some new light on what happened. And one of the things that I'd never heard before is that the disaster at reactor 4 was not the first Chernobyl serious major accident. There was a partial meltdown of reactor 1 some years before reactor 4 disaster that I'd never heard of until the BBC, the current BBC documentary, which is really well worth a watch. It interviews a lot of Chernobyl workers who were there. It exposes it as completely fallacious and not the palliative, no, sorry, the placatory line that only 31 people were killed as a result or died as a result of Chernobyl disaster. And in fact, the real number, particularly of the sweepers, the poor guys that had a minute to clear whatever highly radioactive material they could off the roof of the building, numbers of those, thousands of those were exposed and have died subsequently, but that has been obscured by USSR and Soviet record keeping to minimize the effects of Chernobyl. There are numerous articles about it. World Nuclear News, not my favorite news source, but in this instance, it's done a good job of talking about the accident and laying out in some detail what happened, and the fact that it was the Swedes that first spotted that something was up, thinking it was one of their own reactors that had developed a fault, only to work out by analysis of the radiation that it wasn't theirs at all. And it was, in fact, brought by a wind from the south all the way from Ukraine before the whole of Europe went down. Now, in terms of the 40th anniversary, there are numerous articles about. I was struck by a photograph in the Eye last Saturday. Are we now 26th, the 25th, of a woman in near Chernobyl walking through an avenue with placards showing all the villages that had to be evacuated around Chernobyl. Their residents would have been the most severely affected by the radiation from the disaster. And stories, it made Radio 4's national news on the morning. It's not been hugely covered, but it remains the case. And the flawed reactor, let's not forget that the link to the present day is that the European pressurized water reactor, the EPR, that's being developed worked on at Hinkley Point C is a reactor that's hardly got a trouble-free history and appears to be too complicated for its own good, as any EDF nuclear engineer worth his salt would be only too happy to tell you. The point about the inadequately trained personnel wasn't that they were inadequately trained, is that they were kept in ignorance of the real state of the reactor and the way it had been constructed. Only the people at the top at Chernobyl knew that those guys carrying out what they just thought was a straightforward safety test, just they could tick a box, was going to lead to a disaster and a catastrophe. And unfortunately, the night shift, who shouldn't have been doing the job, contained some overzealous people who unfortunately did things that were beyond their scope and that they'd not been told, for reasons of national security, I suspect, what was going on. And the lies that followed, the cover up that followed, not don't shed any cheery light on how things might go. When let's not forget, the constructors of Hinkley C aren't a commercial firm, which wouldn't have started in the first place, but are the French government and the Chinese government in thin disguise. So that's the warm up. Now let's look at what's happened mostly locally in the last month or so, with a few national points. Now, you'll know that there is currently no electricity being generated whatsoever from the Hinkley site. The A station is in the latter stages of decommissioning. Hinkley B went out in July 2022, and the nuclear material has all been removed, as the NDA and personnel are only too happy to tell us. So it's interesting to note that they're beefing up the security at Hinkley B after all the nuclear material has been removed, the most radioactive nuclear material. So I think we can count that as locking the stable door after the horse has bolted. Other things that are going on at Hinkley C, you'll be aware that fish protection is a major issue for EDF. They've made a great play on the fact that this is the first Bristol Channel reactor to have got proper fish protection, and there have been plenty of failures at Oldbury, Berkeley, and the first two Hinkley stations before we get to here. Now, this is all about freshwater intake and outfall, and I'd assumed that what they'd already built was that was it, and it was keeping the poor unsuspecting fish and all the smaller bits of fish out of the intake water is what the fish protection was about. But EDF themselves have said that they're ready to start tunnelling the second of three fish protection measures at Hinkley C. The fish return system will be 620 metres long and 1.8 metres in diameter. This is no inconsequential pipe. It's not a 6-inch pipe. The tunnel boring machine has been given a cheery name, but I'm fascinated that with all the work that's been done, suddenly there's this extra tunnel going out there, and I'm not clear why and how that helps the fish protection. There are plenty of proponents of new nuclear in this country. They mainly have the ear of the major political parties, and particularly the printed media. There's only one or two papers whose feature and comment writers can see the flaws in going for new nuclear. Although you won't find a single finance guy who thinks there's any merit in going nuclear with new build. Now, one of the lobbying groups is called Britain Remade, and there's some work by the Ferret in Scotland has found that, surprise, surprise, there are links between the guys involved in Britain Remade working for a London-based public relation firm that represents, you won't believe this, EDF, who of course are the major new build people. So that's a little thing to be going on with. Um, the other main issue that surrounds nuclear power generally is what's going to happen to all these tons of radioactive waste that will come out of decommissioned power stations and, of course, the spent fuel. Now, Sellafield, the most radioactive place in Britain, is where it's all currently being dumped, and there's no better word for it than that. But there are plans to build the geological disposal facility on some, dump it on some unsuspecting community. Um, but the Nuclear Waste Services Organisation, who are supposed to be finding a suitable site, has just warned of significant uncertainty since last year's spending review and further uncertainty over whether any consenting village or town would remain committed to the project for the great length of time, hundreds, thousands of years, for which the waste will need to be safely, reliably, and not just out of sight and out of mind, but not polluting groundwater is the major threat from that. But they're doing that. And one of the ways in which the government plans to overcome one of those hurdles is to remove the block that a local community could put on them being dumped with the geological disposal facility. They won't have a final say. If the planners say it's okay, irrespective of any local concerns, government can just say, this is it. Right. Now, the other new build, which is sort of first dipping its toe in the water, and perhaps maybe doing so only too literally soon, is Sizewell C in Suffolk, where coastal erosion on the east coast raises questions over the protection for the Sizewell C nuclear plant. Now, this is also an issue at Hinkley C, and we believe that just building a seawall a bit higher doesn't alter the fact one jot that the accelerating rate of climate change, global warming, and sea level rise means that Hinkley Sea could simply become an island with a seawall keeping out the waves on one side, but inundating seawater, basically cutting off the transport that's necessary, the transport connection that's necessary to keep the place functioning. That's a shocker. The other new thing, of course, are small modular reactors in which Rolls-Royce, most reliable British manufacturing company, heavy duty, never find a broken down Rolls-Royce by the side of the road, is promoting. Although, of course, they can't come up with a small one. Theirs is advanced because it's midway between a small one and the size of Hinkley C. And they're under pressure to use British steel as opposed to Czech steel, because the government's going to fund all their development work and things that are happening. But Rolls-Royce wants to cheapen that by using foreign Czech steel rather than ours. Another issue which involves foreign power is Russia and the fact that Russia supplies a great amount of the nuclear fuel for our current reactors. And the Times had a story about Putin's grip on our nuclear power. More than 2.5 million UK homes are powered by the Kremlin's supply of nuclear fuel. And Western countries have found themselves trapped in long-term contracts for said nuclear fuel, and our current nuclear reactors are stuck with that. Now, what else? Cheer you up with? Oh, yeah. Never content with the man that's currently there. Hinkley C sees another change of management. The troubled nuclear project, as it's been described, we describe it, but other organs describe it as that as well. Has now got a new boss. We'll see how he gets on. Of course, it being April, you'd expect something about April Fool's Day, something different on the 1st of April. As far as I could tell, there were no April Fool's Day stories concerning anything nuclear, which at least says something about the seriousness with which we should take the topic, even though there are strangely laughable things that happen. The other, to finish on something, um, the it's two interesting things is that 25th of March 2026 should also be a record day because it was when Britain's fleet of onshore and offshore wind power turbines, together with our solar and other renewable energy producers, delivered nearly all of our electricity needs. Now, you can be forgiven for not knowing because it wasn't in the interest of proponents of new nuclear to let you know that, or the people who say we should be drill, baby, drill, and keep gas-powered power stations going. It's not in their interest at all. Interesting to note that despite all the horrors about oil fuel supply, BP's profits have gone up to £2 billion. So it'd be nice to know when they're going to make a contribution to the supposed saviour of carbon capture. The other thing to finish on is that there's a guy up in Scotland who is hollowing out a mountain to build Britain's biggest battery. This is a story from the Times. He's making a cavern it's all about water being pumped into places from which it can then flow out, generating electricity to replace. There'll be a loss, but electricity that's being generated and can't be used needs to have somewhere to go. And he's hoping that this scheme he's got will do the trick. On that slightly cheerier couple of notes about the power of renewables and innovative ideas, I'll leave you to ponder other happy states of the world. Thank you very much and look forward to talking to you again. Bye for now.